Ladies and gentlemen.
So welcome everyone. We are with SRAP Live and we are doing a panel on nitrates, which is a very important topic. My name is Maria Payan. I am the regional representative for most of the Chesapeake Bay watershed states. I have with me Daria Minovi and Dr. Chris Grobel. Nitrates have been a very important topic here. As some of you may know, my family was affected by industrial agriculture. We had a lot of health effects, and there were times when I was actually pulling my son out of the bathtub and rushing him to emergency care. So this is something very close to my heart, as well as something that people need to be educated about. And we'll get into that more in depth. So I want to first start with Daria Minovi. Daria, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for having me here today. So my name is Daria Minovi. I am a policy analyst at the Center for Progressive Reform. I also have my Master of Public Health and have a background in environmental health and policy, environmental justice, and also climate adaptation and mitigation.
Thank you, Daria. Now we're going to go over to Dr. Chris Grobel with us. Chris, if you can please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Hi, Christopher Grobel. I'm in Northwest Lower Michigan, and I'm an environmental consultant that specializes in environmental impact assessment. And I do a lot of courtroom work as an expert on matters of groundwater, wetlands, lake systems, streams, and rivers. Started my career working with state government and then have worked in a number of capacities since. Co-owned an engineering firm doing environmental investigation, groundwater, and investigation and cleanups. And then spent some years teaching at university. And now I am an environmental consultant on my own, doing public interest consulting and public interest courtroom work, environmental justice, and the like.
So, Dr. Grobel, tell us a little bit, the folks who may need a deeper understanding. What is hydrogeology?
Yeah, hydrogeology is the study of groundwater. And we can think of groundwater as what people commonly talk about as the water table. The Earth's surface is 70% water. And of that, 97% of the water on the Earth's surface is salt water in the oceans. And only 3% is actually fresh water that is on the Earth's surface. And of that 3%, a very small 0.6% is available for human use. So taking that even further down, we're studying the movement of groundwater, the water beneath the Earth's surface, within that tiny fraction of available fresh water. So the study of groundwater is a couple of things. How deep is the water? What kind of quality is the water? And is it of a quantity that is useful to human consumption or for other uses? And we express all these things mathematically. And I'm not going to get into jargon so much, but I'll try to return to common language about these concepts of groundwater science as we go along.
Yes, that's great. So how many people in the United States, Chris, rely on groundwater for their drinking water?
It's a little over 50% nationally. And even some of our big cities rely on large groundwater systems. But we can think about the U.S. population as really spread from coast to coast. And that whole center part of the country, the Midwest, the Northeast, and the Central Valley in California are heavily groundwater dependent for drinking water, and they have nitrate problems significantly in those regions.
To Daria, I want to bring up something here on the Delmarva Peninsula. We had some issues in Delaware over the past few years where we had some very highly publicized problems with contamination of private drinking water wells. We had near the Mount Air processing plant in Millsboro, there was a community there when Mount Air was trying to expand, who is located near the facility. And in looking at the application and some contamination of wells that was in the reports in the application, talking with neighbors, we started seeing something very, very alarming, which is one of the reasons I feel like this is so important, this information for the public. So we found that there were birth defects in the area. There were next door neighbors that were having miscarriages. We had a lot of gastrointestinal problems. There was people with pets where their pets were having seizures. Near the facility there, the processing plant, from house to house, I couldn't believe what I was finding. People with tumors on their bodies, pregnant woman having seizures. One of the members in the community, their son died at the age of 24 with an asthma attack. We had severe problems to where you knew that something was definitely not right. And through testing, we found a lot of contamination there of private wells. So I'm going to go back to Daria. Daria, what is the safe drinking water threshold for nitrates in drinking water?
Thanks, Maria. So in the United States, we have the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is the primary federal law governing the health of the nation's drinking water. And under this act, the Environmental Protection Agency must set enforceable drinking water standards for various contaminants, nitrates being one of them. And for nitrates, the maximum contaminant level, or MCL, in drinking water is 10 milligrams per liter, often referred to as parts per million. This threshold was established by the EPA in 1962, based on an earlier study that found 278 reported cases of blue baby syndrome, which is a condition fatal to infants with nitrate levels above that 10 milligram per liter threshold. So under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the EPA must reassess these thresholds every 6 years. Unfortunately, they've actually never updated the MCL for nitrates, despite emerging evidence that indicates that this standard is not protective enough. And to the story that you were sharing, unfortunately, this act does not apply to folks who rely on private wells for their drinking water.
Yeah, so I mentioned some of the health concerns, and I'll tell you there was many more that we were dealing with. I wish that we could have some folks that actually were in the situation. There's a seal to where they cannot talk about some of this. So, Daria, tell us what are, you mentioned the blue baby syndrome, but what are some of the other health concerns with nitrates?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, nitrates in drinking water are known to cause blue baby syndrome, also referred to as methemoglobinemia, and that's a condition that's fatal to infants under 6 months of age through oxygen deprivation. However, especially over the last 20 years, there's been an emergence of research that has found an association between nitrates in drinking water and certain types of cancer, especially colorectal cancer, pregnancy complications, and thyroid disease. And in some studies, these effects were actually observed at levels less than 1/10 of EPA's threshold of 10 milligrams per liter. So as a result of this research, a lot of public health experts are starting to pose this question of whether we should be updating this MCL to a more stringent standard like 3 or 5 milligrams per liter, where some of the research shows is the threshold after which you start seeing adverse health impacts.
Yes, and I know that the EPA back in like 2005, this was a safe recommendation going back that far. So, Daria, who is the most affected by nitrate pollution in groundwater?
Yeah, so the people who are most at risk from harm from nitrates in their groundwater and as a result their drinking water are those who rely on private wells, because as I mentioned earlier, those are not regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So while some states do test water quality when a new well is drilled, Maryland is actually one of those states. There's no requirement to test well water quality regularly, and that puts the onus on the well owner to monitor their water quality. And oftentimes people who rely on private wells are located in rural areas, and these also happen to be the sites where there's a lot of industrial agriculture that's contributing to this nitrate contamination. So as you'll see on the screen, we have an image. This is just sort of tips that they have for well owners. And you'll see they have test your water annually, test if the odor, taste, or appearance changes. Be sure that you don't have sources of contamination near your well. And while these are great tips, I think one thing to note, especially about nitrates, is that they are colorless, odorless, and tasteless. So unless you're testing your water annually, you might not know that your water is contaminated based on your senses. So as I mentioned, private well owners are certainly the most at risk, but we know that EPA's safe drinking water threshold for nitrates is also outdated. And so people who are even relying on their public utilities for drinking water might be exposed to levels that are going to be hazardous over the long term.
Yeah, and that's a really important point that you mentioned, that nitrate, if your well is contaminated with high nitrates, it is not going to be coming out black water. It's not going to have any kind of odor that would identify it. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that. I'm going to go back over now to Chris because obviously in the Delmarva watershed, we are talking about severe expansion here with CAFOs. And what are some of the main concerns about CAFOs, the groundwater, drinking water quality, the hydrology?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you. And first of all, about 12% of private drinking water wells in the country are estimated by EPA to currently be contaminated with nitrates. And the number is likely higher. That's a relatively old number, but that's the number available. A couple other things first. Nitrate, we talk about in groundwater as the most stable form of nitrogen in groundwater. Nitrogen in the environment goes through a cycle, and it can be of a whole number of forms. And then if it makes its way from soil to groundwater to surface water, there are yet further conversions of nitrogen in the nitrogen cycle. But nitrate we focus on in groundwater because that's the stable form. CAFOs are a significant source of contamination, pollution, as well as incubators for future viral epidemics. But as it relates to groundwater, the facilities themselves, they have to be managed in such a way that the waste is contained and then offloaded, taken off-site typically, and disposed of in what's supposed to be a safe way. There are problems all along the way. I've spent a career cleaning up things that weren't supposed to leak, things that were designed to never leak, that oftentimes do, or over time eventually do. So waste pits, containers, underground tanks, and the like. So the facilities themselves are typically sources. The other thing we see with CAFOs is we have a very significant local deposition in and around the facilities from ventilation, from atmospheric deposition, from dust, from litter, what have you, onto the ground surface itself. And then the stormwater systems, no matter how well designed and built, essentially convey things like nitrogen, phosphorus to surface waters and so on. So that's the first thing. The second thing with CAFOs are the waste disposal locations. Most of the time, waste is hauled in a semi-liquid or liquid fashion off of these factory farms onto farm fields in what's called land application, and they're commonly sprayed on the ground surface, typically tilled in or sometimes not, but a cover crop is supposed to go on those fields, right away to absorb these nutrients at what's called an agronomic rate. So the need for the plant to grow should be equal to the amount of waste being applied. And that's where we have a problem, where there's often over application on wet fields, application in and around storm events, whether it be rain or snow. And many of these fields are tiled or drained to the nearest stream or ditch. And so we see conveyance and pollution move around that way. So CAFOs are very significant as a source. We call these things non-point sources. And in my work, we don't typically have good monitoring. It's up to the public to do their own monitoring. And as it relates to citizens sampling their own wells, as Daria said, when the well's first drilled, there's a requirement for a test, including nitrate. But it's an inexpensive venture. We really would encourage people to do that. Find a local licensed lab. It's going to be less than $50 to have nitrate analyzed.
So I want to talk about our on the Eastern Shore here. Obviously, certain areas are going to be more sensitive, I would believe, depending on geology, hydrogeology. Here we are in a coastal region with very sandy soils and some shallow wells. So in relationship to how this works when you're dealing with geology and hydrogeology, what is the fate and transport of nitrates, Chris, in the groundwater, especially when we're talking about the Delmarva region?
Yeah, it's very site specific, and it requires some science be done, that we look at the soil textures and types to depth, that we look at the depth of groundwater. We determine groundwater flow direction. Groundwater is always moving in some direction, and there's a gradient. So determining what that is. The water table is going to be the equilibrium point between water pressure from below and atmospheric pressure from above. And determining all those things is really your first step. What direction is groundwater moving? At what rate? You have to have at least 3 monitor wells to figure that stuff out, but that's kind of like hydrogeo 101. Then in terms of fate and transport, like I said, nitrogen is is in the form of nitrate, very stable in groundwater. And there are some forces that will determine how far it'll move and how fast it'll move and where it ends up. Typically, we'll be seeing the near surface contamination of groundwater rather than deep groundwater contamination. And nitrate will move in sort of a cigar shape, 3-dimensionally, with that groundwater flow direction to the nearest stream or lake or place where it can vent. If it hits, meaning flow into the surface water, if it hits somebody's drinking water on the way, then they're essentially tapping into that contamination plume. So I won't go through the whole list, but how fast is it moving? Is it going to disperse? Do we have beneficial bacteria along the way that will continue to break it down? Will there be partitioning, meaning some of that nitrate will get turned into other forms of nitrogen? A whole bunch of things need to be determined, and all are typically determined, commonly done with hydrogeological investigations. The thing about nitrate, though, is if you have it in groundwater, it's hard to clean it up. And we don't typically just let it sit there, which is now legal in some communities. The first step would be to put people on bottled water and or a point of source filtration system, so it's filtered prior to their use in the house. And then a pump and treat system, filtration and cleanup, that kind of thing is really our only options with nitrogen. As it relates to that region, I've done some work in Delaware, Pennsylvania. For the first time, I've been at this for 35 years. And for the first time, I've actually seen, bacteria levels in people's drinking water, groundwater, at unsafe levels. It's unheard of in other parts of the country. But we have such vulnerable water wells and susceptible groundwater and soils allowing that contaminant to reach people's drinking water, that we have some very severe problems on the eastern seaboard there, the Chesapeake area.
Yes, that was one of the things we were talking about before. I was mentioning about Mount Airy. I know when I was looking at the permits, some of the bacteria in levels were supposed to be below 200, and they were over 1 million. The nitrates in the spray field and some of the permits there should have been under 26. So they were at 600 and some. So there's really clear effects of what can happen with high levels and how it impacts human health. So, Chris, what can be done to prevent groundwater contamination from CAFOs? Is there something that can be done better?
Yeah, that's the essential question. We need to very carefully cite these kinds of facilities, CAFOs, and other, polluting facilities in the first place. Oftentimes, these facilities are built in wetlands, literally. I'm working on 3 cases right now where they're building these facilities in a wetland where the groundwater is at the surface. And then after citing, making sure that we have a sound regulatory structure, there's meaningful monitoring done. And then, there be some careful application of waste. So a couple things. It is highly unethical and it is highly commonly done where there is no monitoring. There certainly is no groundwater monitoring around these facilities. We make our best educated guesses on groundwater flow direction, even because nobody's done the studies. So it is unethical to use people's drinking water sources, and for the health effects that, Daria already mentioned, and others, as monitor wells. We should not be letting people's drinking water become contaminated before, we know about an issue. That's number one. Number two is we need to have a very careful rethought and reformation of our policy and our legal requirements of these things. We need to strengthen the certification and permitting system. There should be, monitoring surface waters, groundwater. There never is. We have to go to court and fight site by site by site to try to get that sort of thing done. And we very rarely get it. Sometimes we do with a court order. So those are some things, but the $64,000 answer, Maria, is these facilities, if they're going to exist, need to be operated in such a way that they don't pollute. They don't contaminate people's drinking water. They do not contaminate surface waters. Every other industry in the entire country has to work that way. Why is this different? And I would subscribe that it's not. So we have a lot of reformation work if these things are going to exist. And as long as I'm on it, we need to decide as individual citizens if we're going to spend our money in such a way that we support, industrial farming. Certainly people have in a small way, but in an important way, been moving away from that model. And I think the more we do that is another part of the solution.
Very well stated. And Chris, you talked about research, and I'm going to go back to Daria because Daria just completed a study of nitrates in drinking water on Maryland's lower eastern shore, which has really drawn a lot of attention to some of the results. So Daria, would you like to highlight some of the results?
Sure, happy to. So in Maryland, as I mentioned earlier, private wells are tested when they're drilled. So through Public Information Act requests, we were able to collect, or rather acquire well testing data from 3 counties on Maryland's lower eastern shore. That was Somerset, Wycomico, and Worcester counties. And in addition to another county that's on the eastern shore, these 3 counties that are adjacent to one another are home to the largest number of CAFOs in the state. As of October of this year, there were nearly 300 registered poultry CAFOs on the lower eastern shore. So from our analysis of the well data that we received, Wicomico and Worcester counties had roughly 1 out of 14 wells that were tested between 1965 to July of this year. They had nitrate levels that were above EPA's threshold of 10 milligrams per liter. The highest reading that we found was 135 milligrams per liter, which is very hazardous to health. So if you do apply a more stringent standard, like I mentioned earlier, with a potentially 3 milligram per liter standard for nitrate levels, we found that nearly 1 out of every 10 wells in these two counties had nitrate levels above 3 milligrams per liter. So on the slide on the screen, you can see the locations of these wells. On this map, we were able to geolocate all of them. And all the wells between 3 to 10 milligrams per liter are light pink, and the wells above 10 milligrams per liter are a red color. And the reason why Worcester County on the right seems to have more is because they actually provided us with the most data, whereas unfortunately Somerset and Wicomico County were only able to provide us with a small sample since they maintain these records in paper form, which I think is another challenge that we can address on a later date of the record keeping for this data. We also looked at the consumer confidence reports for public water utilities. These are reports that utilities are supposed to publish publicly every year. They're supposed to test all the contaminants that are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act every year and publish those and share those results with residents. So of the 13 utilities that reported nitrate levels, and I say that because not all of them did, but of those that reported nitrate levels between 2018 to 2020, 8 of those had concentrations exceeding 3 milligrams per liter. All of them were in Wicomico and Worcester County, and that does not exceed the 10 milligram per liter cap under the Safe Drinking Water Act. But from a public health perspective, that is certainly concerning that people could be drinking water that might have adverse health impacts over a longer term. And then the Sharptown system in Wicomico County actually did report a range of nitrate levels that exceeded 10 milligrams per liter. And from what we could see, there was no effort to notify residents that it might be a hazardous level. So overall, based on the data we received on private wells and also public utility data that we reviewed, we estimate that at least 61,000 people in Wicomico and Worcester counties may have been or are currently being exposed to nitrate levels in their drinking water at a level that is potentially hazardous to their health.
So, Daria, I want to reflect a little bit on something that you brought up, and actually I think Chris brought it up, which is the fact that there is not a lot of results. And thankfully, we have folks like you, Daria, that are doing this research, which is so important to communities. And Dr. Grobel, the analysis of these sites reflect the need. So I'm going to go back to Daria because I understand that the study that you did, the research, also included a nationwide scan of protective policies and programs for private wells. What were those policies and which states need to do more to protect private well owners? Daria.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, so in our analysis, we looked at which states have adopted 10 key protective policies and programs to protect private well owners. These include things like low or no cost test kits, like we know in Delaware, there are the $4 test kits, requiring testing when a new well is drilled, which is not necessarily a requirement across the country, requiring landlords to test their water periodically and disclose those results to tenants, which is somehow not a standard, and also providing free online access to well water data, among other things. So in our nationwide scan, and as you can see on the map on the screen, we sort of counted how many policies and programs each state had. We found that 5 states, Alaska, Georgia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, that had the fewest protective policies for private wells. These 5 states only had 1 to 2 protections in place. And I think considering the high concentration of poultry farms in Maryland and that about 13 to 19% of residents rely on private wells for their drinking water, I think the state is seriously failing its residents who rely on private wells. I think also Chris mentioned earlier that we've done research in Pennsylvania and that the eastern seaboard seems to have an issue with nitrate contamination. So I think it's certainly telling that 3 of these 5 states, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, are Chesapeake Bay states, and they're really falling behind on addressing issues with contamination, not just of nitrates, but all drinking water contaminants in private wells.
Wow. So to highlight those states one more time, because often I think sunlight is the best disinfectant. Daria, which states are they that really need some help on their, the policy? Which states were they?
Yeah, so the 3 of the 5 states that only had 1 to 2 protections in place for private well owners, those were West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland.
Okay, so folks from those states, you know who you need to talk to, your representatives, about having this very serious problem addressed. So, Daria, how can I test my water for nitrates? And what do I do if my water has high level of nitrates?
Yeah, so I think, so if you get your water from a public utility, you can go online to your county's health department website or to the Department of Environment and find the consumer confidence reports with water testing results for the last year. They should also mail those results to you, but you can find them online at any time, and you should certainly take a look. You would be ideally notified if there was an issue with contamination, but I think, again, because of this concerning public health data around lower levels, I think it's still worth knowing what you're drinking. For private wells, again, unfortunately, the state of Maryland doesn't provide financial assistance to private well owners to test their water yet. Hopefully that will change. But as Chris mentioned, it is not necessarily super costly to test your water. It depends county by county. But if you have a private well and want to test your water, you can find a list of state-certified water testing labs on the Maryland Department of Environment's website. Other states, that they should have a list of those state-certified labs on the state environmental department's website. So if your water contains nitrate levels above 10 milligrams per liter, stop drinking it immediately, especially if you are if you have an infant or you're pregnant. I think anything above 5, perhaps take the same precautions. From there, I think you can either contact your county health department to see if it's possible to drill a new well, or you can look into investing in a water treatment system like reverse osmosis for your home, since unfortunately boiling and chemical disinfection do not remove nitrates from drinking water. So putting a filter is not going to help. You're going to need a more sophisticated system for either your whole home, or if you want to, something more affordable, you can just get a kitchen treatment system for where you're presumably getting your drinking water. I do want to note that these systems can be expensive. And so we are hoping that Maryland and other states will eventually provide financial assistance for people who have contaminated wells to be able to treat their water. And as I mentioned earlier, please always remember that nitrates are colorless, tasteless, and odorless. Just because you can't sense them doesn't mean that your water is safe. So we certainly recommend testing your water once a year if you have a private well.
Yeah, that's great advice. And Chris, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of things real quickly. If you are sampling your own water, we need to make sure you do it in a correct fashion so that the numbers mean something. First of all, you'd want to get the container, a sterilized container from your lab that you're going to use. And you use nitrile gloves, not latex gloves, but the nitrile gloves that are available when you sample. Also, you want to sample it from a place where it's not going through a water softener, not going through a water heater. You take the aerator off your kitchen sink, meaning that little attachment at the bottom of the faucet, and where the water comes out, take that off, then run the water for 15 minutes, and then collect your sample so that you're drawing fresh water out of that system and it's not going through any other systems, water heaters and the like. And then as it relates to any kind of filtration, if you're in the unfortunate circumstance of having to filtrate or reverse osmosis filtrate your own water, make sure that you keep those filters up to date and cleaned out and replaced regularly. Those systems are only as good as the maintenance on the filters. And boy, people in Flint have been living with this for the last many, many, many years on different issues, lead. But, just having a system in place is not enough. You have to maintain them.
Right. And I want to follow up with a couple things about this. So I was having a conversation with a gentleman that I've known at EPA for years. And we were talking about the nitrates and even the high nitrates, as you mentioned, Chris, in some of the public water systems. And he told me he has, a system put on, even though he is on public water, he has a system as well, which is great if, folks can afford that. One of the issues, and again, we work in a lot of environmental injustice communities where we have minorities, we have lower income families who are doing their best to get by. And being able to afford a water test a couple times a year to make sure that their water is within safe drinking water limits can be a big burden. Unfortunately, most of the areas that we work in are environmental injustice communities. They don't build many of these in the wealthier districts or next to the governor's mansion, unfortunately. So, Chris, you touched a little bit on what we, the people, can do. But I'm going to give both you and Daria a last word on that before we cut away to a clip directly about the Eastern Shore region from Kathy Phillips from our Assateague Coastkeeper. So, Chris, what can we, the people, do? What can we do?
Yeah, it's oftentimes the same answer to these, multifarious, multi-layered, complex problems. But we have to be vigilant. We have to become educated. We have to organize. I get to work in cases in court a lot. And that's not typically for, small communities. We have had NAACP and other groups step up and pay for expensive litigation and studies, but that's a very, very much of a minority of cases. And it is not a good public policy. We don't want to direct public policy by litigation. Litigation at best may change policy on occasion, but that's not what we're about. This should be an everyday thing. So we need to organize, we need to get educated and stay vigilant. I think we also need to be, as I said earlier, very careful how we spend our money. Very careful in terms of what kinds of agriculture we support as relates to environmental issues, environmental quality, and environmental justice generally. I think that it's, sometimes we get fatigued. Oh, yet another issue, COVID, national election, protests in the street. These are very, very difficult times. And here's yet another issue. Well, this is one that predated COVID, certainly, and isn't going away. So we need to take a breath, be vigilant, and be intentional in how we spend our funds. I would also say that, and that's both personally and politically, socially. Also, I would like to say before we end that nitrate in groundwater is naturally occurring. It isn't something that nature hasn't already placed there. So we have to be knowledgeable of that. Where I live, it's primarily has been a fruit production area, cherries, apples, in particular cherries. And now it is gentrifying and converting into a winery region where we had one winery when I moved here. Now we have 33 in my county. And with a population of something like 18,000 people, that's a lot of wine tasting rooms. But anyway, we already have relatively high nitrate levels in the ground. and in the groundwater. And one interesting thing I've noticed in some of my studies around in this region is after trees are removed through forestry practices, especially large cuttings, we'll see a shock of nitrogen run through the groundwater. I've seen that following golf course construction and the like in this region. But getting back to your question, how we proceed is, that hard work of rolling up our sleeves and doing it all. But it starts with education, making sure that we're on the proper policy direction, and some vigilance with protecting our own health and testing our own water supplies.
Excellent advice, Chris. And Daria, I'm going to throw the same question to you. What can we, the people, do? Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. I think Chris made some great points as well. And I wanted to highlight and add to something that you mentioned around environmental injustices. In our research in Maryland, we found that these counties where there are a large number of CAFOs and are grappling with nitrate contamination, that they have two of these counties had the highest number of Black residents of the 9 counties on the Eastern Shore. And these counties also had higher rates of poverty compared to the rest of Maryland. And in addition to that, the health effects that are associated with nitrates, like cancer and adverse birth outcomes, were higher in these counties compared to the state. And I think it's a real issue that we need, I think, especially now, and the conversations we're having around systemic racism, it is worth noticing and drawing attention to the fact that this pollution can and will contribute to increasing the gap in health disparities, and that we're, public health folks are trying to address all the time. And until we can recognize that, the decisions that are made to site many CAFOs in one location and to not address issues around water contamination are due to an unjust system and decisions that are made, many steps before that are having downstream impacts on people. So I think just being aware of that and trying to understand and parcel out the sort of systemic structures that are contributing to this are always really important. I think, that is one task. But again, like Chris mentioned, education, testing your water, being aware of this, and then pushing your local health departments to be more involved in this and advocating for their, these departments to get sufficient budgets. When I was talking to these local health departments, I heard over and over again that they were like, we just don't have enough funding, or after our budget was cut in this year, we couldn't do adequate record keeping. So, advocating in your local community for your county agencies to be well resourced, and then putting pressure on state lawmakers to invest in communities, and even all the way up to the EPA. I think, I always think starting local is best, but the EPA in 2017 had published a plan to do an updated health assessment of nitrates in drinking water. And in 2019, they actually decided to suspend that due to, putting priority on other things or whatever else their, EPA has been putting off and rolling back over the last few years. But I think that, there's power in the people and being aware and just highlighting the ways that decisions that are made, years past are impacting communities now, I think is really important. And hopefully we can, undo these injustices and ensure that people are, like Chris said, that their water is not where we're monitoring and figuring out contamination.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And one more thing I want to highlight before we go is we were, as Daria and Chris, as you both mentioned, the science is now much more prevalent than what we had 20 years ago. And they are even tying some of the science to developmental disabilities, which, Daria, you just reminded me of this when we're talking about communities that are taking the brunt of this pollution are environmental injustice communities. And the fact that your zip code can possibly determine if you can develop to the best of your abilities because of pollution. It is really an unforgivable sin that we can't look away from. So
Yeah.
I want to thank
one closing thought, Maria. One closing thought, if I could, real quickly.
Yes.
Of the dozens of cases I've worked in, I have yet to be asked to work in a community that was wealthy to stop a potentially polluting facility or to get it to be appropriately monitored. So, the poverty issue in this injustice is key. I think also real quickly, what people can do is to reach out to groups like the Socially Responsible Agriculture Project and they're nationwide and other organizations, but it can lead to a whole network of assistance on all levels of this issue. Technical, organizing, understanding the regulations, how things work, economics, all of it. So, thank you both, but thank you, Maria, for organizing this session. And SRAP, you will hopefully provide, if you haven't already, the contact information for at the end of this session. So thanks to you both.
Yes, absolutely. And I also will be providing the contact information, Daria, for both you and for Dr. Grobel, so that folks can get in touch with you. And we're going to flip it over to Kathy Phillips, and we want to thank everyone for attending this important session, and let's all work together to fix some of these unforgivable crimes against humanity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Kathy Phillips. I'm the Acetate Coastkeeper, a member program of Waterkeeper Alliance, and the Coastkeeper is hosted by Acetate Coastal Trust, an environmental organization that has been here on the Lower Eastern Shore for 50 years. I myself have lived in Worcester County for about 45 years, and I recreate on the water, in the water, around the water, all year long. And over these years, I have watched the change to our coastal waters. Our bay waters have become more heavily sedimented, and I have noticed that just from all these years of kayaking and sailing my little sailboat on our coastal bays. But in the past 14 years that I've been the coastkeeper, because I am now monitoring the actual waterways and monitoring the quality of the water and learning so much about what impacts the quality of our water, I have noticed significant change to the health of our local waterways and, quite frankly, our communities. Now, Northern Worcester County has definitely expanded and developed residentially and commercially over the years. But what has more significantly changed here in the coastal watershed is the type of agriculture. As our small, diverse farms with orchards and row crops and raising some chickens and perhaps raising some hogs have disappeared from our landscape due to the industrialization of our agricultural system here on the lower shore. Those small farms have consolidated into massive land holdings where only corn and soybeans are being grown, and those corn and soybeans are being grown to feed the millions of chickens that are now being grown on the lower shore. So we have lost our agricultural diversity, and instead we now have a system of ag that contributes sediment to our waterways, that contributes excess nutrients to our waterways, and due to the industrialization of the way chickens are being grown on the Eastern Shore, we have a significant problem with these enclosed facilities that are growing 40,000, 50,000 chickens inside each building. And ammonia is created inside those buildings. If that ammonia was allowed to stay inside the buildings, the chickens would die. So there are massive fans and exhaust systems built into these animal feeding operations that discharge that ammonia-laden air inside these houses out into the air that all of us are breathing. And as these poultry operations begin to concentrate more and more here on the lower shore and expand, we are facing a significant problem with ammonia deposition, which is adding nitrates to our surface waters, and also because of the land application of the waste and the manures from these animal feeding operations being land applied, we are also seeing significant spikes in nitrates to our groundwater, which in turn impacts well water here on the lower shore. Most residential areas, unless they are inside an incorporated city limit, are on well water. And we know through studies that have been done by the U.S. Geological Survey, particularly in lower Delaware, that wells are contaminated with nitrates. And so it is time that we need to really rethink how we want our agricultural system to look on the lower shore. Do we want to continue this expansion of raising chickens in an industrialized manner that consolidates small farms into large operations that are only growing corn and soybeans to feed the chickens, and their waste then goes back out onto these fields where the corn and soybeans are being grown? This just exacerbates our problems down here. So it is definitely time that Delmarva, but especially the lower eastern shore, needs to go back to a more diversified system of agriculture. There's a new generation of farmers who want to have small independent farms. They want to feed their local community. They don't want to raise millions and millions of chickens and be saddled with a contract with a corporation. They want to manage and be responsible for their own farms and for their own livelihoods. And we need to take a look here on the lower shore at zoning ordinances, as well as statewide legislation that will help the small farmer do what they want to do and not be a roadblock to them because they don't want to be industrial scale. This will improve our waterways. I am hoping that this conference will encourage conversations that will help us make the changes that are needed to bring our agricultural system back to a more diverse system of growing multiple crops and smaller amounts of meat animals, and return to farms that sustain small communities. We have seen the loss of small villages and towns here on the lower eastern shore because of the industrialization of our agriculture. And that's a sad thing. The impact to the waterways also impacted our fisheries, and our watermen have had a tough time of having a successful business. And we've lost small towns like Stockton and Girdletree and others. And these were once vibrant small farm communities. And we need to get back to that, if not to save the Lower Eastern Shore, but be a model for the rest of the country, so that we can begin to save this earth.
I'm getting more comfortable.
Okay, so here we go. We're going dark.
It came from Mel Gibson. Freedom!
When I could see you. Yeah, that's right. That's right. There you go. All right, good luck, folks.